Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Webinar Wednesday series from TLC. My name is Ria Stark. I'm the Digital Engagement Manager here at TLC, and I'm really excited to be able to share this webinar with you all. We're going to be talking everything RFP, the request for proposal, and our objective today is to really help libraries navigate that evaluation of getting a new library system or an ILS, and kind of navigating the selection minefield, so to speak. So this is going to be a two-part series. This first part is about the RFP, and then if you join us again in 2 weeks, we'll be talking more about purchasing cooperatives as an alternative to the RFP process. So stay tuned for that. A couple of housekeeping things before I introduce our guest today. There are a few handouts available. You can download those anytime throughout the session. Please feel free to. There is also a questions panel. If you have any questions throughout the session, drop those in that, and we are going to answer those at the end of today's call. And then there are going to be a few polls, which I'll introduce in a second, and this will be recorded. We get that question a lot. We're going to be recording this. It's always available the next day at tlcdelivers.com/webinars. So I'm going to ask my producer on the back end to launch our first poll for you, and then I'm going to introduce our panelists. So this first poll is asking you all, where are you at currently in the RFP process for your ILS? Has it been a while? Are you just getting started? Are you currently out to RFP? Maybe you've recently completed your selection and you're going through the contract process, or maybe this doesn't even apply to you. So please go ahead and take a minute to fill that out. And while you all are responding, I will introduce our panelists. We have Joe Reimers here, who is a sales engineer for TLC, and he's usually on the back end responding to the RFPs that go out from libraries. And with us also, we have David Robbins from the Equalis Group, and they're a partner of TLC, and I'm going to let him talk a little bit more about that when we get there. So we are getting some responses. It looks like the majority of you either saying NA, this doesn't apply, or it's been a while. So we'll go ahead and close that poll. And I'm going to hand it over to you, Joe, to go ahead and get us started. And I'll be back on camera at the end of the session.
All right, thanks a lot, Ria. Welcome, everyone. As mentioned, I'm Joe Reimers, and I am a sales engineer. I've been working in libraries for 25 years now, both libraries and library services industry. And I've seen this, the RFP process from both sides very up close and personal. As Ria mentioned, I work on RFPs pretty much all the time. That's what I do. Prior to that, when I was working in libraries, I was up close and personal with those conversations and those discussions. So really, I've got a lot of hands-on experience, both having those conversations as a librarian, as well as responding to RFPs from the vendor side. David?
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. So my name is David Robbins. I'm a Director of Product Development here at Equalis Group. And much like Joe, I've worked on both sides of the RFP, from responding and really tailoring those responses to the end recipient, to developing those RFPs or procurement documents. And so I've had a lot of experience like Joe, and feel that offer a lot of good insight as to what is important from a buyer's perspective, as well as what are some tips and advice when navigating an RFP process of your own and responses.
All right, thanks, David. As the title of the webinar mentioned, there are 5 elements that we've identified for a successful RFP response, and I'm not going to keep you hanging in suspense. Those are: allow plenty of time, do your homework, engage your stakeholders, focus on outcomes, and remember that it's all about you. And for the next 30 to 40 minutes, we're going to discuss these elements and what they actually mean. And these don't just apply to your ILS RFPs or decisions, but they can apply to any library, technology, or other type of RFP that you might want to go with. So these are very general, but we're going to be talking about them in the context of ILS searches. So let's begin with allowing plenty of time. The RFP process is, or can be, fairly long and drawn out. And the last thing you want is a rushed process where you have to hurry. And generally, we recommend that you want to work backwards from your desired go live date. So if you know, for instance, that your contract is going to expire in July of 2023, you start there and you begin working backwards to figure out how to pace yourself. It's very important that you build in room for things like delays, scheduling conflicts, and missed deadlines. And personally, my own opinion is that it is never too early to start planning for an RFP. Even if it's going to be 5 years out, it's good to have it kind of in the back of your mind and just start thinking about it. I've seen that, in my own professional library career, saying we're very busy right now, but in 5 years we're going to be in a position where we've got to set that up, and you can begin talking about what it's going to take to set up the budgeting, who's going to be making the decisions, all that sort of thing. And doing that 3 years out really is not too early to be doing that. So there are several stages in the RFP process, and in broad strokes, those are the pre-RFP, the in-RFP, and then the implementation. And pre-RFP is everything that is not in RFP or implementation. And during pre-RFP, you're doing things like your market research, you're discussing your formation of your committees, you're designing your RFPs, you're looking at the landscape, talking with people, all of that stuff that you do to get yourself set up for an RFP or an RFI or an evaluation. In RFP starts the day the RFP is released. And the difference between pre-RFP and in-RFP is very important, because once the RFP is released, the nature of communications between the library and the vendor changes dramatically. Normally in a pre-RFP phase, or when there's no RFP going on, you can walk up to us at ALA or PLA, ask questions, reach out, send us emails, what have you. Once there is an active RFP, all of that communication is very controlled and centralized and has to follow very, very strict guidelines. The RFP process itself consists of the written response, followed by any demos, and then there's contract negotiation. So you're in that RFP process until there is a signed contract. And once the contract is signed, then implementation can begin. And that's where we have the data conversion, the training, the getting everything set up. And those are really the big stages for that. In the course of that, I mean, it can be, as mentioned, it can be a very long process, but we have identified some very common speed bumps where people have time allocated and things slow down, or there are delays or dates slip. Most common of those is simple scheduling conflicts, especially when you're dealing with larger committees, or you have to get lots of people together. You have to schedule around scheduled library programs, vacations, unexpected PTO, then engaging with us, the scheduling, any of those demos and all of that. Anytime you're dealing with scheduling and trying to bring a group of people together, there's an opportunity for things to slip. Dealing with the bureaucrats, the true rulers of the city or the library or what have you, going through legal review, county purchasing, all those other external watchdog agencies or oversight committees that make sure that all the rules are being followed and that all the T's are properly crossed and the I's dotted. And sometimes you run into shifting deadlines. So for instance, the responses come in, but there's a delay and a deadline extension is approved, or the committee meetings run long, you're unable to come to a decision and you have to defer it to next week. Those are all very, very common speed bumps. And that's why I recommend building in some extra wiggle room to account for that.
Yeah, and of course, you want to be able to manage this process. I think Joe has outlined a lot of good information here, but when it comes to actually understanding the scope and scale and what needs to be done in order to get to that end destination, there's some options that you have. And ultimately, it's got to be a solution that works best for you. And you can look inside of your organization as well as outside of your organization. So there's project management software solutions out there that you can subscribe to. Obviously, the solution or the tool that I like to best implement when looking at the overall project and trying to really put that into more bite-sized pieces is by utilizing a Gantt chart. And so what you see here is an example of our 2020 and part of 2021, where we identified the major portions of our RFP process and made sure that we allotted the appropriate time, and to Joe's point, some additional time to allow for those processes to complete themselves. This is going to give not only yourself, but some of the stakeholders visibility on the progress of your project, and ultimately keep you on track for meeting the goals that you've set in place. Now, this is a very high level Gantt chart. You can get more granular and specific, assign responsibilities and whatnot. But for just a quick picture of what can be beneficial to you and how you can use it, I think this is a great example.
Okay, that brings us to point number 2, which is really a large part of the pre-RFP phase, and that's doing your homework. Start by talking to vendors. Talk to your vendor, talk to other vendors. It's, there's no shame in talking to other vendors, even if you are extremely happy with your vendor. And if you're not happy with your vendor, it's still very important to talk to them. There's plenty of opportunities, take advantage of trade shows to reach out and chat. It's also very helpful to talk to other libraries and librarians. There are both formal and informal groups. I'm a member of a couple of librarian groups on Facebook that happen to be very forthcoming and very honest when other librarians asked, what do you think about this system? What do you think about that system? I try my best to keep my mouth shut because it's really important to build that level of trust and to allow that level of trust to be built so that there's real honest communication. And trust is a really, really big deal in this process. And that's why it's important to have those conversations, because trust doesn't come immediately. It has to be built over time. And it's something that we as vendors have to earn. Also, in the course of doing your homework, it is important to take advantage of user reviews, the annual survey of library automation, and so on and so forth. But really, reaching out to vendors is a critical piece.
And Joe, one thing to keep in mind, especially when you're reaching out to new vendors, is you're likely going to be talking with somebody who's a salesperson, right? And so one urge that you're going to have to fight is the urge to be sold to. You're at a point in time in your RFP where your objective is to gather information, is to take that information and see how it fits within your goals and your objectives. So it's important to kind of keep your guard up to a certain extent and keep that objective in mind, and also be transparent about what your intentions are at this point. Obviously, there's a formal process that any prospective solution provider would have to go through. So just making sure that you're clear, transparent, and then focusing on the information rather than being sold to, I think will keep your head on straight and keep you nailed on to your objective.
And relevant to that is it's generally a good idea to ask for RFPs, sample RFPs. And it's also important to make sure that they are recent sample RFPs because you really want to make sure that your RFP is up to date.
Yeah, Joe, I've got a funny story about that. Now, in my line of business, we procure a whole host of different products and services for agencies across the country. And oftentimes when we're talking with our members or public agencies, they'll share some stories with us. And there was one where, actually there's two I'll share. There was one where an organization had received an RFP, and much like how you would look at a tree and be able to tell how old a tree is by the number of rings in the middle, well, this particular agency could tell how old this RFP was, because over time they had photocopied it so much that the paper no longer sat straight on the paper it was copied to. So it had been copied and rehashed so many times that it didn't even sit straight on the paper anymore. The second I'll share with you is there was an automotive parts supplier who was replying to an RFP. And as you would typically do in an RFP, you outline the specifications of particular products that you want to buy. And so the procuring agency had used, and I'll tell you how old it is in a second, it was old. The reason they could tell how old it was is because it was actually no longer even being manufactured, this kind of grade of oil. So save yourself the embarrassment. Make sure that you're putting together specifications that are recent and relevant and speak to the industry that is obviously going to be reading your RFPs, because they'll be able to pick up on that stuff pretty quickly.
And at the very end, this really is about coming up with a good library system that's going to work for you. And so it's important to dig beyond the question and go to what's underneath the question for what really works. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But arguably the most important part of doing your homework is engaging your stakeholders, because the stakeholders are the ones that know intimately what is going on in the system and all the things that the system does. There is nothing worse for a library or for a vendor than to be elbows deep in implementation and going into training and finding out just before go live that some mission critical functionality is missing because the question was never asked and it was just assumed it was there. The vendor answered all the questions in the RFP. It came out great. But the stakeholder was not consulted and the question wasn't asked. I had an unfortunate encounter with a library a few years back at it was a law library, AALL, the law library show. And a library came to the booth where I was working, and they were not happy campers because their decision maker had made the decision unilaterally to move from one system to another system in an effort to cut costs. And one thing about law libraries is that their circulation levels are low. Their cataloging is about normal, but at the time they were very, very, very heavy and sophisticated users of serials. And the decision was made to go with a lower cost option where the serials was severely underdeveloped. That's no longer the case, and this is all, ancient history at this point, so I don't want to be singling anyone out. But the decision was made, and when they were going into implementation, they realized this serial solution is never going to work. And because they were committed, they ended up having to do all of their serials control in Excel spreadsheets by hand. And when serials accounts for about 2/3 to 3/4 of your technical services processing, and you're having to do it in Excel rather than your ILS, that is an incredible addition to the workload. And what ended up happening was they had to hire additional staff, and all the cost savings that they thought they had gained from the system ended up going up in smoke. And additionally, there was a lot of trust loss between the decision makers and the rest of the staff because that communication never happened and the stakeholders were not engaged.
And Joe, I've had a project, it was a couple of years back. We were working with a local university, Youngstown State University, and they partnered with us to develop a one card. And if you're not familiar with what a one card is, it's basically a student ID for a college campus on steroids. So it's not going to just identify who you are and provide your name, but it's going to aid in your food plan, communicating your food plan, in admissions to sports, parking, access control, getting out of your dorm room and into offices. So it really touched almost every different department within the college campus. And so when you get to a scale of that big, where you're not talking about one stakeholder, you're talking about a stakeholder from every different function of that organization, we had to figure out how to manage that process. And so what we did is we created just cadences or touch points with each one of those heads of those departments to make sure that okay, we're developing this car that's going to have capabilities all throughout the campus. We want to make sure that you're accounted for and that your voice is being heard, so that when we get this solution, we implement it. You're not sitting there scratching your head saying, well, how are we going to integrate this into our access control? So sometimes it's just creating the opportunity at specific points in time to give them access and visibility to the project without drowning them in the details, and making sure that those voices are being heard, and ultimately the solution that you're trying to procure meets the needs of everybody involved.
Yeah, every single library, every single situation is different, and there is no one universal right way to engage your stakeholders. You know better than anyone else, what the dynamics are and how your library is structured. But the most important thing is that all the functionality is accounted for, that there's a clear understanding of how the ILS is being used and what needs to happen. And that can really only come from having those conversations with those stakeholders. And that leads us to point number 4, which is focusing on outcomes. This one I see as a sticking point quite frequently, especially with libraries that have been on an ILS for many years. It's not at all uncommon to see libraries that have been on a system or with a certain vendor for 20 plus years. And I've got a couple of stories about that. So one quick example is most ILSs have holdings records to account for serials holdings, so you know what issues of National Geographic or Time Magazine or Library Journal you have. But you treat that separately from your monographic holdings, where each where the holdings information is often associated with an item record. But certain ILSs have holdings records for every record type. So you'll have a holdings record attached even to single part monographs. And talking to libraries that are used to having the single part monographs and introducing a system that does not have the holdings record on everything, it's confusing to them because they're used to using a holdings record with literally every piece. And when we get RFPs and questions from them, there's that assumption that, can you talk about your single part monographic holdings records? Mm-hmm. And so, we don't use single part monographic holdings records. We store that in the item, and it's like a whole new world to them. Another outcome related story. This one's a lot more personal. It involves my wife, who was involved with RFP requirements committee, and she was working with cataloging and metadata on requirements for a system. And one person on that committee was adamant that the ILS had to be compatible with Macro Express. And for those who don't know, Macro Express is a Windows application that allows for the writing of macros for automated processing of anything. And it's a product that'll work with pretty much any Windows application, but they were using it for batch insertion of fields, deletion of subfields, standardized language and mark records, and that sort of thing. And this person was adamant, you have to support Macro Express, because how else are we going to be able to do these things? And another person on the committee, as well as my wife, pointed out, there are ILSs that have built-in macro functionality that can do this without the need for an external tool. Wouldn't it be better to say macro capability or that sort of capability needs to be required? And again, it's that difference between what do you want the end result to be, namely the ability to make automated consistent changes to mark records, insertion of mark record tags, and so forth, or is the process, namely the use of macro express, the requirement?
Yeah, and Joe, for us, or at least in my circumstances, a lot of the times I have to educate potential respondents on what our outcomes are, because as a cooperative, as a group purchasing organization, we're much different than a single entity that is procuring a single item, right? So that single entity is going to have very specific needs outlined in their specifications that those prospective bidders are going to be responding to. In our world, we're procuring on behalf of thousands of agencies across the country. So we're not necessarily honed into just one specific characteristic or a couple specific characteristics that we want to see out of the product. We're looking at it from the perspective of, do you have the breadth and depth of capabilities to provide these services throughout the United States? And so when we are talking with prospective vendors, that's very different than what they're accustomed to, because they're accustomed to really tailoring that response to the outcome of that specific agency. And in this case, we're really taking all of the needs of those agencies and bundling those into one RFP that can ultimately then be awarded a contract and allow public agencies across the country to buy from that contract. So we have to not only focus on the outcome, but educate downstream on what those outcomes are to ensure that we have what we're looking for in the end.
Yeah, you may have noticed, but there are several businesses that are several companies that are in the business of doing ILSs, and we all do basically the same thing in that we all produce integrated library systems that allow you to manage your libraries. But each library system answers certain questions or handles certain tasks in different ways. And that's why it's really important that the outcomes be the focus rather than the process, because each of us, that's what differentiates us as vendors. And this brings us to the final point, which is that at the end of the day, this is all about you. It's your RFP, your selection process, your library, your community. You know your circumstances better than anyone else. And you know both your public user community as well as your staff community better than anyone else. And the RFP process is really something that can help empower you. It's something where you can look at it and take an opportunity to say, where is it we really want to go? What will help drive us in the direction to be as successful as possible? Because the end goal is for you to be happy, productive, and serving your community. So this can really be a very powerful tool. And I recognize that RFPs are a lot of work and can be a lot of hassle, but they're also really ultimately there to benefit you. And to that, just talking very briefly about some of the logistics behind it, because at the end of the day, you have to figure out how to score your RFP, because ultimately you're going to choose the winner. And the very first thing I want to mention is I don't want to get, money is always a thing, but it is never the be all end all, because the system also has to do the job. I mentioned before about the library that ended up not being able to handle the serials. And even though it was a lower cost system, it ended up costing them more money in the long run because it didn't do the job. So total cost, total value really matter. So when you're doing the scoring and when you're doing the weighting, or when you're scoring and weighting, it's important to emphasize what matters most. Figure out where are you going, what matters most to you, what is the what are those things that are the most important things for your specific library. And you know, other libraries and other vendors can help inform you, but really it's about what matters to you. It's also important though that you give yourself some flexibility. Yes, no is easy, but you also want to have a little bit of room to be able to make a judgment call and say, you know, I think this is going to be a better fit than this other one based on this criteria. So kind of that balance that really is going to work best for you. David, did you have anything you wanted to add on that?
No, I think one thing that we always stress, and you touched on it, Joe, is really, you know, price you can distill down to a number. But really, let's look at it over the lifetime of that product. So we like to emphasize the total cost of ownership. And when you're buying a car, the lowest cost, you know, that you go to the used car lot, you buy the cheapest car off the used car lot, chances are that one's going to take the most amount to keep it on the road. Rather you pay a couple, you know, $1,000 more, you step up another notch, you know, you're going to get a much more reliable car that's not going to require all those out-of-pocket expenses downstream that you didn't plan for originally. So certainly price is important. To Joe's point, it's not the end-all be-all. And there's this concept of value that we really like to tout and really develop contracts that provide you that total cost of ownership.
Okay, so now we're going to do a brief review and then touch base on a couple of additional thoughts before we move on to the Q&A. So once again, the 5 points are to allow plenty of time to do your homework, engage your stakeholders, focus on your outcomes, and remember that it's all about you. This is your process, and we're there to help. So a little bit of additional feedback and a little bit and suggestions.
Yeah, Joe, I've got a few that I'd like to offer up here, as I think they've served me well in navigating RFPs and making sure that we're developing RFPs that are relevant and catch the eye. And so an important part, two important parts of an RFP is one, the title, and two, the scope. Now you can look at those as very interrelated to each other. But here's the take or the angle that I take in when I'm developing the title and the scope. For one, the title is what everybody sees first, right? You go on to where you catch an advertisement on the newspaper or you see through your bid aggregator, here is an opportunity for an ILS. So you want the title to attract the eyes or grab the attention of prospective bidders. But then you want to use the scope to really inform. So identify all those things that are important that you're going to be procuring, all of the characteristics that you're looking for in that outcome. But it's important to really, you know, don't put so much pressure on you crafting the right title, because you're going to really reinforce what you're putting in your title within that scope. And so making that delineation has really helped me put more effort into the scope and making sure we have a scope that meets all the technical qualifications that an organization would look for when evaluating an opportunity.
I have an interesting, it's another little horror story from a couple of years ago on a very interesting RFP, and those of us who responded to it still shudder at the mention of it. But it was an RFP, and I stand by what I was saying, that it's all about you. But one library set itself up by saying they did not want to do a traditional sort of RFP. And if you look at RFPs, you're going to find a lot of yes, no, or variants on yes, no, multiple choice, and narrative type questions. And this particular library said, no, we're very visual learners. we want to see everything. So all RFP responses should be in the form of screenshots demonstrating every step of every major functional area. And that was an awful lot of work, because then we had to go through and create these screenshots and enter them into the response, which also made for an incredibly long printed response. It was hundreds of pages. And we submitted it, but these screenshots lack a lot of context, because one thing a screenshot cannot show is what happens in the background that you don't see. So for instance, with circulation, when I'm triggering a circulation exception, it might show the warning that there's a circulation exception, but it doesn't show what it's doing or not doing with the holds queue, for instance. The only way to go back is to go and look at the holds queue and see if it triggered. And these are things that a screenshot can't show, but which a narrative very easily can. And what I would have suggested for that library is, instead of doing, screenshot everything, they should have gone with a short, simple written RFP, and then allowed for a much longer, much more extended live demo period, where they can get in the room and have that interactive, viewing and Q&A to see all of those processes. Because, speaking as a vendor, we're happy to do demos, and I've seen demos go anywhere from 90 minutes for the whole thing all the way up to 3 days. And this is where it's all about you comes back to, it is all about you. And if you want to have 3 days of in-depth demos, that is absolutely fine. It's really about making sure that you get your answers in a meaningful way without compromising the answers.
Yeah, and one tip I have for the group, and this goes back to an earlier point you made about doing your homework. And sometimes you don't know where to start, right? An RFP is a big project, and sometimes finding the first bit to bite into is hard to do. So there's a couple sources that you can explore to kind of generate or jumpstart that creative process or the RFP development process. And so whether it's talking with fellow libraries and requesting, have you done any similar procurements? And you get a confirmation, yeah, in fact we have just last year, or maybe earlier this year. The more recent the better, obviously. Request to see a copy of that. Borrow some of the ideas that are incorporated into theirs if it fits your profile, if it aligns with your needs, if it helps reinforce that this solicitation is about you. The other side is vendors commonly respond to RFPs quite frequently. And so they have an eye on a lot of different RFPs and probably have a good sense of what a well-written RFP looks like. So don't be shy about asking your current or other vendors that you're working with or could be working with to send over examples of really kind of hallmark or really quality, well-written RFPs. And that'll help, shave some time off of your development process.
All right. And with that, I think we've come to our Q&A period, because we've run a little bit over our half hour, but I'm going to pass things over to Ria for Q&A.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Joe. And so please feel free to jump into that questions panel and ask anything that's caught your attention. While you're doing that, we do have a couple of polls that we would like to share with you. The first one actually addresses one of the questions that we just got recently. Someone was asking about one of the handouts for the sample RFPs. And so our poll question is, if you would like to receive a sample RFP from TLC to get you started, please click that first button. Yes, send me the full RFP. The one in the handouts is only a 2-page example. A lot of RFPs can run, the shortest RFP I think I've ever seen was maybe 15 pages, all the way up to sometimes 50, 70, all sorts of stuff. So if you want to see a sample RFP, the full length of it, please hit that yes, and we'll be sure to send that over. There's also an email address in the handout if you want to reach out independently of this poll. So we'll give that just a second. And then the next poll that we have for you all is if you are doing your homework and you would like to have a demo from TLC for a personalized ILS conversation, please hit that first yes on that poll there, and we'll be sure to reach out to you after this webinar. We do like to do some demos through Webinar Wednesday as well, so be sure to jump back into our archives. I'm sure you'll find some good ones, but if you want more of that personalized conversation to really make it all about you, we are more than happy to have those conversations. So please hit yes, and we'd be happy to reach out. I'm trying to vamp a little longer to get more questions into that question panel too. So if you are thinking about something, have a question for the group, go ahead and drop it there. All right, I'm not seeing anything else come in. Joe, if you want to go to the next slide, I'll talk through our next webinar, and then if you're typing a question, I'll give you time to hit enter on that. So David Robbins has been here from our Equalis Group, and we're so grateful to have you. One of the things that TLC has done is participate in an RFP process for a purchasing cooperative. And so we'll be talking about that a lot more in our next webinar. But say you went through this webinar today and the RFPs seem a little bit intimidating, you don't really know where to start, or maybe that's just not your thing. Purchasing cooperatives are such a great way to be able to kind of bypass that process in a legal and efficient manner. So Equalis Group is one of our partners that works on that, and we'll be talking through what that means, how you can join a purchasing cooperative, and some of the benefits of being able to do that. So please register at tlcdelivers.com/webinars to be able to join some of David's colleagues next time talking about purchasing cooperatives, which I cannot say 5 times fast. That's a tough one. All right, and I'm not seeing any more questions in the in our questions panel, so hopefully that means we've addressed everything that's been on your mind. And if not, we'll be reaching out for everyone who said yes to that. So again, thank you, Joe. Thank you, David, for a wonderful presentation today. Our recordings are going to be out tomorrow, so check back on the website and check your email. And as always, stay safe, wash your hands, and consider getting vaccinated. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, Rhea. Thank you,
Thank you.
everybody.